Today's reading is Matthew 18, verses 1 through 10. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus. So then, they said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus called a child and stood her in the middle of them. "I'm telling you the truth," he said. "Unless you turn inside out and become like children, you'll never ever get into the kingdom of heaven. So if any of you make yourselves humble like this child, you'll be great in the kingdom of heaven. And if anyone welcomes one such child in my name, they welcome me. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to trip up," he went on, "it would be better for them to have a huge millstone hung around their neck and be drowned far deep in the sea. It's a terrible thing for the world that people will be made to stumble. Obstacles are bound to appear and trip people up, but it'll be terrible for the person who makes them come. But if your hand or your foot causes you to trip up," Jesus continued, "cut it off and throw it away. It's better to enter into life crippled or lame than to go into the eternal fire with both hands and feet. And if your eye causes you to trip up, put it out and throw it away. Going into life with one eye is better than going into hell with two. Take care not to despise one of these little ones. I tell you this, in heaven their angels are always gazing on the face of my Father who lives there."
Some of you are probably old enough to remember that. So some of you are much too young, I'm sure. But that was Crosby, Stills and Nash, of course, from 1970. Teach your children, the song, Teach Your Children. Graham Nash wrote that song when he was a member of, what was the band? The Hollies. So he wrote it before Crosby, Stills and Nash actually got together. But it became one of their most famous songs. It was quite often an encore song in their concerts, their live events. Of course, this was written in the 60s when our culture was embroiled in cultural revolution. We were stuck in the Vietnam War. A lot of protests going on about that. All kinds of cultural upheaval and unrest in America and around the world, really. And so Graham Nash, in addition to being a musician, is a photographer. And he's always appreciated other photographers' work. And this photo that you see here is a photo by a photographer named Diane Arbus. And when he saw this photo, this inspired him to write that song, Teach Your Children. It's this picture of this young boy in, what's the big park in New York City? Yes, Central Park. Yeah, holding a toy grenade in his hand with this really pained look on his face. When Graham saw this photo and contemplated it for a while, this became the inspiration for Teach Your Children. Nash was one of those kind of prophetic voices in the 60s and 70s, kind of like Bob Dylan and some other that came out of the folk scene. And they were, I think they had something prophetic to say to the nation, to the world. Often it was kind of lost in the din of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So, sometimes prophets come along with some baggage. and they come along with some other things, and that makes it easy for us to discount them, to kind of cast them aside. But yet I think there's still something important to what they have to say. So let's look at the lyrics briefly. "You who are on the road must have a code that you can live by, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. Teach your children well, their father's hell did slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams, the one they pick's the one you'll know by." And in the chorus, "Don't you ever ask them why, if they told you, you would cry, so just look at them and sigh, and know they love you." And the second verse is interesting because it kind of flips the perspective to the child's perspective. "And you of tender years can't know the fears that your elders grew by. And so please help them with your youth. They seek the truth before they can die. Teach your parents well. Their children's hell will slowly go by. And feed them on your dreams. The one they pick's the one you'll know by." So this text that Sherry Ann read for us today from Matthew 18 is about children. Jesus calls a young child to himself. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child whom he put among them and said, Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I don't believe that Jesus is talking here about going to heaven when you die. You know, when the question is asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? I don't think the disciples were thinking about the afterlife when they asked that question. It's quite easy for us, especially if you're from an evangelical background, to superimpose ideas about the afterlife on texts like this, to think that Jesus is talking about going to heaven when you die. That's problematic, though, because in verse 3, Jesus says, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So unless we all become like kids, we can't go to heaven when we die? I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about at all, and I don't think that's the question the disciples asked him. And I think Jesus would at least try to answer the question that was asked of him. Sometimes he does it in a roundabout way, admittedly. But the kingdom of heaven to the disciples at this time was a here and now concept. It was the kingdom of the Messiah, the kingdom of the Christ. Peter, just 2 chapters before this, and we've talked about this last week, had made this confession. He identified Jesus as the Christ, the liberating king, as the Messiah. This is the person they've been hoping for centuries to come. But they weren't looking for the Messiah to come and take them all to heaven. They were looking for the Messiah to come and establish the kingdom of Israel again on earth, and to make them the premier kingdom in the world. At least that's how the disciples thought about it. And last week we considered Peter, who just correctly identified Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah, who then when Jesus began telling the disciples what he would do, in other words, he would go to Jerusalem, he would suffer and be killed and raised again on the third day, Peter rebuked him. So he got the identity right, but he missed the substance of who the Messiah is completely. Right? So he clearly, this is a good lesson for us to learn. We can get the concept right, but completely misunderstand it, the purpose of that concept. So he understood the identity of Jesus, but completely missed how he was going to work out his messiahship. Peter was thinking kingdom of heaven on earth when he said that. All right. Of course, Peter, when Peter tells Jesus that, and when he rebukes Jesus, trying to instruct the Messiah on how to be the Messiah, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Jesus was starting to tell them that what they thought was up is actually down, that it will be the meek, not the strong, who will inherit the earth, that it will be the poor, not the wealthy, who will be blessed in this kingdom, that it will be the peacemakers, not the warriors and emperors, who will be called children of God. So we can see that with a question about who will be the greatest in God's kingdom. When the disciples ask that, they still don't understand what Jesus has been trying to teach them since the Sermon on the Mount, way back in chapter 5 and 6 and 7, right? So Jesus then, perceiving that they still don't get what he's been trying to teach them, he calls a child and places the child in the middle of them and says, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So again, Jesus isn't talking about the afterlife here. He's talking about entering the way God rules the world here and now. So the question we have to ask is, in what way does Jesus mean that we must become like children? Does it mean we just fall down and have temper tantrums when we don't get our own way? I don't think so. Does he does he mean that we just have to be of low intelligence? No, I don't think that either. And because kids aren't low in intelligence, they're growing, they're learning, right? So he begins to explain what he means by you have to become like children in order to enter this here and now kingdom that I'm establishing in the next verse, in verse 4. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. So humility is what Jesus is looking for. He's looking for us to become like children in the way that children are humble. or greatness in God's here and now kingdom is evidenced by humility, not by bluster, not by national pride, not by nationalism, not by hubris, not by self-confidence, not by great political authority or strength, even though that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a political kingdom, the kingdom of God. It is a polis, it is a political kingdom, but it's not evidenced by all of the things that we expect to see in our political leaders. He's saying, in my kingdom, it's humility, not hubris, bluster, nationalism, self-confidence, strength, or political might. It's none of those things that matters in my kingdom. What matters in my kingdom is humility. That Greek word that's translated as humble here means to abase oneself, make yourself low, to bring low, or to be devoid of haughtiness. We could have a little more of that in our political world these days, couldn't we? A little less haughtiness. So, but at this time in the first century, children on the social ladder were at just about the same rung as slaves were. They were considered property with no rights of their own. So this would have been an offensive statement for Jesus to make to his disciples, who had been seeing Jesus work miracles, feed multitudes, heal people left and right, drive out demons. Man, they were on a high, right? This guy is the king. This is the Messiah. We're going to take over. And then he tells them, no, you need to see yourself at about the same level as a slave in my kingdom. Man, talk about bursting their bubble. He's saying you have no claim to any rights. And then in verse 5, Jesus makes welcoming and associating with humble people, those who are not on the high social ladder, the same as welcoming him. See, whoever welcomes a humble one like this in my name, welcomes me. He actually says, I'm to be found in people like this. This is where the king of the kingdom is to be located. Then in verse 6, Jesus issues this really stark warning. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. I've underlined and starred those two words, stumbling block. They're translated from the Greek word scandalon, which we've talked about a little bit here. It means a trap or a snare or an impediment that draws one into sin. If you want to get really technical about it, it's like the trigger on a mousetrap. You know, when you flip the bale over and you latch that trigger across it, you hook that trigger in, so that's what it is. It's something that's very easy to fall prey to. You only have to just barely entertain a thought in that direction and you can be caught in the trap, right? So this warning that he's giving his disciples, remember, this is all in the context of the kingdom of God, the here and now kingdom of God, not the afterlife. These disciples are asking him, how can we be the greatest in your kingdom? And Jesus says, well, first of all, you've got to be humble like this little child. You've got to lower your expectations for what being somebody great in this kingdom looks like. And he tells them to beware of putting a stumbling block, a scandalon, a trap or a snare or an impediment in the way of one of these little ones. In other words, he's saying, teach your children well. Teach your children well. Be aware of what you teach and how you teach your children to be. And then in verse 7, he says, woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. There's that word again. Occasions for stumbling, there it is again, are bound to come, but woe to the one to whom the stumbling block again comes. So 4 times the word scandalon is used in these 2 verses. Now, when Jesus told his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and be raised on the 3rd day, Peter objected, and N.T. Wright's version says he told Jesus off. In other words, he told off the Messiah for being the Messiah. or he was trying to instruct the Messiah on how he thought the Messiah ought to be. And Jesus' reply to Peter then was, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block." There's that word again, scandalon, to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. I wonder if the disciples made this connection. I don't think it was a long period of time that separated these two events, the time that Peter rebuked Jesus and Jesus rebuked him, and this lesson. It comes 2 chapters later. We don't know exactly how long it is in between, but the fact that Jesus used that same word 4 times might have reminded them of this serious rebuke he gave to Peter. Do you think they remember Jesus rebuking Peter, and that it was specifically about Peter being a scandalon to Jesus that he was rebuking Peter? And in what way was Peter being a scandalon or a trap? Well, Matthew is more than any other writer in the New Testament uses this Greek word. He uses it 19 times out of, I think, around 30 total occurrences. And he uses it in a particular way all through this gospel. Peter was telling Jesus that Jesus should be a violent Messiah, that Jesus, a Messiah that used the sword to slay his enemies. In other words, Peter had no place for a humble Messiah. Peter just couldn't conceive of the Messiah having a humility about him. And when he did that, Jesus used this word. So you are a scandalon to me. You're a stumbling block to me. Peter only understood kings and kingdoms built on military strength. And he expected the Jewish Messiah to be like that. But Jesus will not stumble and become that kind of king. That's what's going on here. Jesus says, I won't stumble and fall into what you expect of me, Peter. And I think probably the other disciples expected it too. Peter's just the one that always blurts it out, right? There's always one in the crowd, right? So I'm sure the others were still thinking this way. But Jesus refused to stumble, to trip over, or to fall prey to this trap that Peter was offering him. Peter was offering him the trap. That's why last week we talked about this was a real temptation for Jesus. You know, when Peter says, no, that shall never happen to you. You won't die that kind of a death. Jesus was fully human. That's what we confess. That had to have been a real temptation of his. We looked at some Mark Heim quotes last week where he really explicates this idea that this was a real test for Jesus. It was another temptation very similar to the one in the wilderness, where Peter is offering Jesus an alternative method right here. See, when Peter rebuked Jesus, he was tempting him to enter into rivalry with Caesar. That's what he was really doing. He was tempting Jesus to enter into a rivalry with Caesar. That was the trap. That's the tripwire. If Jesus could see himself like Caesar, he would enter into rivalry with him. Caesar was the head of the Roman Empire, which Peter saw as a rival kingdom to the kingdom of God. Peter saw Caesar and Herod and Pilate and the entire Roman Empire as a rival empire to the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. I mean, it seems so obvious to him. It seems so obvious to us, doesn't it, today? So when Jesus tells his disciples that he'll not enter into rivalry with Caesar by fighting him, Peter erupts and tells Jesus off. I think it was a temptation for Jesus, but he doesn't take the bait. He doesn't stumble into mimetic rivalry with the Roman Empire. In other words, Jesus won't consider even Caesar as his enemy, his rival. This should not surprise us, because he said in the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So Jesus is simply following his own teaching here. But Peter, even though God had revealed to Peter that Jesus was the Messiah, he hasn't learned this lesson. So here here in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus associates enemy love with becoming children of God. See, children of God or citizens in the kingdom of God love their enemies. And God makes his sun rise on both the good guys and the bad guys. And he sends rain on everybody. And rain is not a bad thing in this case. You need rain to prosper. What kind of God is this, anyway, that Jesus is describing? Well, first of all, it's a God who does not show favoritism. He sends the sun and the rain on everybody. It's a God who loves even those who are enemies to him. It's a God who is not scandalized, not tripped up, even by his enemies. And it's a God who will not enter into rivalry. And these very characteristics should be the characteristics of children of God. We should adopt those. We should not fall too far from the tree. Right? We should adopt those same characteristics in order, as Jesus says here, to be considered children of God. These are to be the characteristics of God's children: non-rivalrous, humble, generous, not given to showing favoritism. So with all that in mind, let's return to the warning that Jesus gave to his disciples here. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. Occasions for stumbling are bound to come, but woe to the one by whom the stumbling block comes. So we sometimes think that this is a general warning about harming children. I've seen people, or heard people use this text as a warning against child abuse. And while I think we should not commit child abuse, I don't think that's what Jesus is saying here. I think he's specifically answering this question. Remember, who's going to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And this is part of Jesus' answer to that. The stumbling block that Jesus mentions 4 times here is the temptation or the trap or the snare of falling into mimetic rivalry, which leads to conflicts that then escalate into animosity and lead to grasping of power, which are antithetical to humility, to being humble. So in the place of all that, Jesus calls for the humility of a child. Children who had no rights in that culture, that were on the same level as slaves, that had no expectation of greatness. Children just didn't have that. And it's here that Jesus issues a most solemn warning about how we teach our children to live. This is what he's really saying. You have to become like a little child, but you also have to be cognizant of how you're teaching your children to be. Just like Graham Nash's song. He has one verse about the parents and another one from the children's perspective, and we'll look at those lyrics again. But before we get to that, I want to just do a quote from René Girard from his book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. And he's speaking of this passage right here, and he writes this: "Woe to the one by whom scandal comes." Jesus reserves his most solemn warning for the adults who seduce children into the infernal prison of scandal. The more the imitation is innocent and trusting, the more the one who imitates is easily scandalized, and the more the seducer is guilty of abusing this innocence. Children are innocent and trusting of their elders. That means that we have a great responsibility as their teachers, because they trust us. If we model for them a rivalrous nature, a tendency to see those we disagree with as rivals and as enemies, that in itself is the trap. We are setting a trap for our children when we teach them to live that way. In fact, we are bound, trapped, ensnared, and we will be ensnaring our own children if we're not careful. Teach your children well. Their father's hell did slowly go by. So once we're ensnared in mimetic rivalry, you've entered hell. and there's no quick or easy way out. So Gerard continues and says, scandals are so formidable that to put us on guard against them, Jesus resorts to an uncharacteristic hyperbolic style. If your hand scandalizes you, cut it off. If your eye scandalizes you, pull it out. So he's not being literal here. He's just saying this is really serious. He continues, Jesus would not be astonished that his teaching is not recognized. He has no illusion about the way in which his message will be received. To the glory that comes from God, invisible in this world, the majority prefer the glory that comes from humankind, a glory that multiplies scandal as it makes its way. It consists in gaining victory in mimetic rivalries, often organized by the powers of this world, rivalries that are political, economic, athletic, sexual, artistic, intellectual, and yes, even religious. So Nash's songs, these two verses, I think kind of mirror this approach that Jesus uses in this passage in Matthew 18. I have no reason to believe that he was familiar with it when he wrote those verses, but it's just an interesting comparison. So if we go back to verse 1, you who are on the road must have a code that you can live by. What code are we going to choose to live by? We're going to live by the code that of humility, of the kind of life that Jesus modeled for us, or are we going to fall into that trap of scandal that causes us to see people we disagree with as enemies, to see the world as a cat and dog rivalrous environment? Then it says, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. So the code we choose to live by will make us who we are. However we choose to live will become who we are. We can look back upon our lives and see the effects of that code on how we've lived. Is it rivalrous or is it humble? Competitive or generous? Our past will tell the tale. And he says, teach your children well, their father's hell did slowly go by. So Jesus reserves his most solemn warning for the adults who seduce children into the infernal prison of scandal, like Gerard said. And then he says, feed them on your dreams, the one they pick, the one you'll know by. So we model our rivalries for our children. We become rivalrous models if we're not careful, and that's how our children learn that. We don't have to teach them in so many words to become rivalrous, do we? All we have to do is act it out. We just have to live that way, and they'll catch it. We model our rivalries for our own kids, and when we do this, we influence the dreams that will become their dreams. Because if your dreams are all wrapped up with, typically what you dream to become is wrapped up in the method you use to get there, right? So, like when I graduated from high school, I wanted to be a musician and work in a really world-class TV studio or recording studio, and I had a method in mind about how I was going to get there. I prayed, to God about it, and I ended up getting there within 5 years, but it wasn't the particular path I thought, But oftentimes we will, people will say, you'll read books about leadership, and they'll tell you, make a plan and stick to your plan and execute the plan and do the plan. So that when we demonstrate that for our kids, they'll get it. And I'm not saying there's something wrong with that necessarily, but if it's rooted in dog-eat-dog rivalrous competition, then we'll be teaching our kids that that's how life is to be lived. Then if we go to verse 2, he flips it around and it's from the child's perspective. And you of tender years can't know the fears that your elders grew by. So this is a call to children to not adopt the fears and rivalries of their parents. So he's really asking, because he's writing to young adults at the time, and asking them to think about how their parents became the people they are. And if you remember that this was when there was a whole thing about the, what do they call it, the generation gap or something. So that was talked about a lot at the time, about how different the teens and 20s age people were from their parents. And this is where this comes from. And so please help them with your youth. They seek the truth before they can die. Jesus says, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. So we can learn from our kids, especially before we've indoctrinated them into living the faulty ways that we have. Teach your parents well. Their children's hell will slowly go by. So the world that our children create can be a repetition of their parents' hell, or our children can teach us a better way. And feed them on your dreams, the ones they pick, the one you'll know by. Jesus said, whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom. And whoever becomes one such child in my name welcomes me. So, as I wrap up today, here's just a few questions. Does it make sense that Jesus wasn't speaking here of the afterlife, but that he was speaking of a here and now kind of kingdom? Also, have you ever thought of this passage in Matthew 18 as a specific teaching and warning about falling into hellish rivalries and not teaching our kids to do that? Or have you thought about it like I did for a long time, just as a general teaching about not being mean or bad to kids? And then I never really could figure out in what way are we supposed to become like kids? In what way specifically? And is this passage really a parenting lesson? And we have several teachers in here today, so you guys just have started your school year again. And you guys, probably more than the rest of us, understand the responsibility of teaching children, and that what we teach our kids shapes and influences their lives, not just for the year or two that you have them, but for the rest of their lives. I mean, we can all think back on probably a teacher or two that really was formative in how we thought, and that stuck with us for many years since. So, yes.